Well, maybe we'll get settled and we'll begin, because this is going to be a great panel. I'm really looking forward to this. It's kind of like dessert, I figure. This is my dessert, a big chocolate cake of discussion about Russia. And we want to make sure that, since there's a lot of interest, that we have enough time for people to talk and time, certainly, for questions. And we only have an hour and a half, so we'll begin. My name is Jill Dougherty. I work with CNN. And Russia is something that I've been interested in for a long time. And that's one of the reasons that I really want to hear what our guests tonight are going to say, most of whom I know. And actually a number of people in the audience I know as well. So looking forward to this. I want to begin, as you look at your program, you see the title, Can Putin Contain Post-Putinism? But I don't think it would be a Russia discussion unless you knew that our panelists decided that they wanted to kind of debate whether that was actually the question or not. So we've come up with something that's similar, but a little bit different, which is essentially, what does the return of Putin, and I know return is a word that we can define, but Mr. Putin's return to power as president mean? And maybe I think we could also further define it as, can Putinism be reformed? But we'll get into that a little bit later. And we have a sterling panel here, beginning at the end, Lilia Shevtsova. She is with the Moscow Carnegie Center. Many of you know the panel, but I'll introduce them anyway. We have Bobo. He is an independent scholar and consultant, expert on Russia and also China. Anders Åslund, who is our economics expert from the Peterson Institute in Washington, D.C. And then we also have James Sherr, who's with Chatham House. So I want to jump right in. Perhaps we'll start with Lilia. Lily, kind of set us up, if you would. You have said many times that the presidency, the prime ministership, or let's call it the regime of Mr. Putin is in crisis. Do you believe at this point, having been elected as president, a number, depending upon what you believe the vote actually was, resoundingly returned to office, do you believe that he is still, or he and his leadership are in crisis?
Well, Jill, if you allow me, first of all, I would like, looking at Kadri, to express my thanks, to pay special attention to Russia, because we have two sessions in Russia, one without wine and the second with wine. Kadri, I would believe that it's a kind of very interesting and ironic thing that you included Russia into the conference that is devoted to democratic capitalism. But, well, we'll try to be ironic. And there are my friends and colleagues from the Russian opposition and Russian experts in the audience. I don't have any kind of monopoly on the Russia's narrative. And I would urge my friends simply to take part, either in this session or, if we don't have time, in the session with wine, which will be really fun. Jill, and let me start with a rhetorical question. You said that our panel is a kind of dessert. So I'm thinking whether maybe in Estonia, do you have dessert that is bitter?
bitter chocolate.
Oh, okay, something resembling Swiss. You answered, well, you asked the question that allows me to formulate my summary, in fact. So, in fact, you are asking us, what does Putin's official return to the Kremlin means? And my shortest answer, and the most crude answer, will be, his return to the Kremlin means clarity and certainty, which, by the way, is a positive phenomenon. Yes, Putin's return to the Kremlin already means a positive thing, because in the era of ambivalence, ambiguity, to have something certain, to have understanding what Putin's return means for the Russia's trajectory and for the Russia's attitude and relationship with the West is already a positive phenomenon. Well, just look, folks, for yourself. If the national leader returns to the official palace of the Russian czars using absolutely cynical, arrogant, and aggressive fraud. And the developments around his return, I mean brutal force against the peaceful demonstrations. Around 1,000 people, by the way, Ilya Ponomarev, one of the representatives of the Russian opposition, just fresh from Moscow, he may correct me, about 1,000 people so far have been retained, which means that Putin's corporation, the ruling team, is not going to leave the Kremlin voluntarily. And at the same time, the people, hundreds of thousands of people, who took to the Moscow streets, and not only in Moscow, who came to Moscow on train, by car, on foot, to take part in the demonstrations against the fraud, against the Putin's regime, they not only shed the myth that has been yesterday pronounced that this is political culture that doesn't allow Russians to believe in the rule of law and democracy. So they, in fact, demonstrate that they are ready to confront the regime, which means that Russia has embarked on a very dangerous, very turbulent path of confrontation. And the civil confrontation in Russia, in the nuclear state, can have really deep and unpleasant implications. And now, if you allow me, maybe I will give 3 points.
Yeah, I was thinking
before we go, or I can.
7. No, please. 5-7 minutes opening, and
or maybe you want to just to make an interlude with something more optimistic.
Lilia, I haven't heard you say anything very optimistic for a long time. So,
well,
but
that's
please,
why I
continue.
never make a mistake, you know.
No, continue.
Well, several points, but they are unintentionally paradoxical. I've been thinking about the topic of our conference, terrific conference, on democratic capitalism. And I thought that Russia and Russia's sessions are kind of disconnect with the whole topic and the whole theme. And then I came to the conclusion that why? Well, there is a connection. There is something that unites us. And what unites us is crisis. It's majesty crisis. And like Guy yesterday, I welcome crisis. I do believe that crisis is a great game changer. Not only for the West. I hope that the West will use the crisis like you did in the 70s to get out of your own malaise. But in Russia, crisis hopefully will play another role, will help to deepen the stagnation, the rot of the system, and help it to dismantle and to implode. So I do hope that the crisis will play the role that Schumpeter at some point believed crisis should do for the rotten civilization, the role of creative destruction. But the problem is that we cannot solve our problems, neither after crisis nor during the crisis, if you continue to be in your malaise. Point number 2 that I prepared, I've been thinking about it also kind of rather paradoxically, on inevitability. Well, it's good to have certainty, at least something in Russia. So certainty is about one thing. At least I do believe that we have the Russian consensus on that. That the system is not reformable from inside, point blank, which means that it needs a pressure, a kind of pressure from outside, which is, revolution. And for us, the existential question is whether we can break this time, the vicious circle, when after each revolution, the next system and the next ruler and the next regime were much more predatory than the previous one. And this is the question mark. Point number 3. On illusions. Illusions about Russia and the West are being formed and born by Russians. We love create illusions. And then, other friends are spreading illusions around outside, in the West. There's one illusion that apparently we also have a consensus about. And this is the illusion about possibilities and potential of Putin's liberal or economic liberalism. Well, at least majority of the Russian political and intellectual milieu believe that liberals in the government and liberal rhetoric of Putin, Medvedev, of Mr. Z and Y are powerful and very serious factor of prolonging the life of authoritarian kleptocracy. It seems to me this piece of phrase coined by the Estonian president is fantastic, and we with Mr. Penkovsky are going to use it broadly. Well, the problem is whether the West is ready to share this illusion together with us. Point number 4. Of course, Putin's corporation returning back to the Kremlin understands that they have to update rhetoric and mechanism of survival. So how are they doing it? I would argue that they've already nearly formed a kind of their Putin's trinity. Well, you can advise me on another word, Bobo. Maybe trinity is not the adequate word. But here's what I have in mind. Putin is trying to use the leftovers of the old traditional Russian matrix. First of all, neo-imperialist moods and statism that, presents continuity of current Russia with the past. But at the same time, if one looks attentively at what the current Russian elite is doing, you'll find the evidence as if they read Benito Mussolini's Dottrina del Fascismo, because they introduce it into the Russian political life. Firstly, the idea of primacy of the state and the leader. The leader has to be macho, and the leader has to play the role of the sexual symbol. Can you just imagine Putin being a sexual symbol? But yes, they tried, to pursue the idea of Putin being macho sexual symbol for Russia, and the idea of reliance and the attempts to rely upon the people, narod, the nation, secondly, on the church, thirdly, on corporatist organizations, fourthly, on technocrats, and fifthly, on praetorians that are getting property as the exchange and payment for their loyalty. There is only one or maybe two elements that are missing from Putin's regime turning into a totally not para-fascist, but fascist regime. Total control over ideas. They don't have any ideas. That's why nothing to control. And, still lack of total control over our private lives. But it still can come. And the third element that I'm not missing, but, my friends I know are going to discuss it. The third element, the attempt of the Putin's Kremlin to use the West as one of the most important means to prolong their life, to replicate, to survive, to imitate, and to get an extra breath. So they still are within the paradigm to be with the West, to be inside of the West, to be outside of the West. Mm-hmm. And the harassment of the American ambassador, Mike McFaul, who's our friend, and at the same time striking a deal between Rosneft and ExxonMobil, Eni, and Statoil is kind of the symbol and embodiment of the new political regime and its technique of self-survival. And the final question, of course, that apparently we are going to discuss during our Vine session, will it succeed? I would argue that apparently yes, apparently the new tactics, and the fact that, the world being in malaise and in trouble would love Russia to be in a kind of, imitation status quo can help Putin's Russia to get a new breath. But there are all evidence that we have the beginning of the process that we can call or define suicidal statecraft, when the instruments, the slogans, the means that have been helping until recently to stabilize situation, to imitate, to be a kind of Viagra for the regime, have started to undermine it. And the only problem and question for us is, what will be the time when we are going to have a new moment of truth, and what will be the payment that we are going to pay, Russia and the outside world. Okay. It seems to me, this is my basis for and pretext for more optimism on the part of my colleagues.
All right. Well, then let's have a touch of Marxism. Let's talk about economics. Anders, give us a reality check on where we are with the country that Vladimir Putin has created economically. At this point, Where do they stand? Has what he has done over the past how many years, 12 years, has he created? Is it sustainable? Are we going to see any reform, or does he just keep doing the same thing?
Yeah, thank you, Jill. And first of all, I would like to thank and congratulate Kadri on a wonderful conference once again. I'm happy for your question, Jill, because I think this is quite important. Think of it. Russia has, in the first decade of Putin, had the highest growth rate ever. In real terms, 7% a year, on average for 10 years. But if you look upon it in current dollars, that Russians tend to look upon, GDP increased from $200 billion to 1.8 trillion from 1999 to 2008. That's a huge change. And I would say that this is what has made Putin possible. If you have sufficiently good conditions around you, you can be tolerated. I would not say that Putin is the cause of it, he's rather the beneficiary. He arrived at a late table after the substantial reforms in the 1990s, plus a large capacity that was free, plus the oil prices. These are the three causes, and Putin didn't really contribute to anything of it. Is Putin predictable? Can we know what he will do? No. And as evidence, I will give you his three periods. The first term, Putin was a state consolidator. He played Siloviki against oligarchs, and he made the state more functionable, whatever we think of it again. It was not nice from a political point of view, but from an economic point of view, this worked. It was a time of substantial economic reforms. And then his second term, lousy state capitalism, no reforms whatsoever, and consolidating a lot of companies into huge state corporations that were dysfunctional. But with a steadily rising oil price, it didn't matter really. And then his third period, when Medvedev formally was the president, that's the period of asset stripping, that Putin quickly moved out assets from the state corporations to his personal friends that he might be in a certain partnership with. So where does this land us? I think that we should first remember that the macroeconomic situation is just about as good as it could be. When the Eurozone is in massive crisis, Russia has a slight budget surplus, admittedly because of a high oil price, but still. Russia is the third largest international reserves in the world of $500 billion or so. It has a huge current account surplus, and the macroeconomy is well run. Now even the inflation has gone down, and Russia has accepted a floating exchange rate. So on the macroeconomic side, there are no concerns. So what are the problems in Russia? Essentially two problems. The first is corruption, and the other is authoritarianism. And of course, you need an authoritarian system to get away with that degree of corruption. And my favorite comparison, that is that the only country in the world that is richer than Russia in GDP per capita terms and more corrupt is Equatorial Guinea. Is this a comparison that a proud historical nation like Russia would like to be in? No, it's an extreme outlier. And if we pick on David's numbers from Freedom House, we find that there are only 8 countries that are richer than Russia in per capita terms and are also authoritarian. And who are they? 7 small oil states plus Singapore. Again, no company for Russia to be in. And my sense then is that we will see lots of modernization pressures on Putin. Of course, it's very bad that Putin has returned, but the good thing is that like people like Ilya Panamaryov and Andrei Piontkovsky here, not to mention Lilia, have been out and contributed to some checks and balances on this regime that didn't exist before. So let me give you 4 reasons why I think that we are likely to see some economic reforms. First is simply Russia is too rich, too well-educated, and too open to be so authoritarian and so corrupt. And one number here. In Russia today, 51% of youth get a college degree, while in the United States, it's 36%. That is completely degrees. You can say that the quality of much of this education is not so high, and perhaps quite a few have bought the degrees, but still, they want to have a college education. We see a big middle class coming. And I love what Dmitry Muratov said sometime last year, the editor of Novaya Gazeta, that there are 2 parties in Russia. One is the television party. It comprises 2/3 of the population, and that is led by Vladimir Putin. Then there is the internet party. It's the other 1/3 of the population. And it has no leader, but Dmitry Medvedev belongs to that party. So the future for Russia belongs to the person who becomes the leader of the internet party. And I think that this is what the opposition now should really be about. And also Muratov said, this election, that is the one that we have just passed, will be the last election that the television party wins. And another reason for modernization is that the oil and gas price can't go up. The gas sector, as we discussed in another session here, is in crisis. And the oil price will go down. So Russia inevitably, if it continues to grow, will diversify away from energy, and because oil and gas production does not really increase and will not increase. And a third reason is WTO accession, which is now coming through. Russia is integrating ever more. It wants to join the OECD. Next year, Russia has ratified the OECD Anti-Corruption Convention, and you should not underestimate the importance of these various international pressures. Of course, it's up to all of us to point out that they should be utilized. But Russia is exposing itself. Money laundering should be applied, money laundering rules should be applied, and then a lot of Russian officials could be in big trouble if that is done at all. And finally, coming back to the political pressures, I think that Putin from now on will be checked, and to quite another extent than before. Of course not democratic, but some checks that didn't exist before. So therefore I think that we will see reforms being undertaken by Putin as bones that are being thrown to the population, because he will prefer to do that rather than democratic reforms. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. You know, I'd like to turn to James now, because we're set up, obviously, the doom scenario, ultimately, that Lilia is putting out. Anders describing a country that does have a lot of economic power, but the key to it, which is oil prices, will not go up. They can only go down. And James, if you could, I guess, answer this question, are we underestimating the ability of this regime by Putin to continue? Maybe I shouldn't even say the word regime, because in a way it's not fair. Let me be a lot more neutral and just say the leadership, the presidency of Vladimir Putin. Are we underestimating the strength of it?
Jill, thank you. First, let me be insubordinate in a predictable way and thank Kadri, but let me do so in a very specific way. And Jill, I trust this is not coming out of my time. What I'd really like to thank Kadri for is helping the expert community preserve its cohesion, because we all, in different ways, feel ourselves under attack from people in our own countries who call themselves strategists, who are looking at bigger strategic priorities, and petty people like budget cutters and civil servants and so on. And you remind us that we have a network, a purpose, and a potential, and I'm very grateful to you. for that. Jill, I think everyone in this room who knows me knows that in any discussion, in any crowd of people, I am the pessimist. Lilia was optimistic. Anders was extremely optimistic. The only person who's occasionally more pessimistic than me is Bobo, and he hasn't spoken yet. But what I want to start by saying, no, nothing is clear. We are in a situation of real uncertainty, and when you are in a situation of uncertainty, what you need is a compass. And if we want to have a compass about Russia, I think what we have to stop doing is what the West likes doing, which is focusing on personalities and talking about Putin, and look instead at the system and define the system in systemic terms. And what we are looking at is a system that is based on the fusion of money and power, not on the basis of laws or rules or rights, let alone property rights, but on the basis of patron-client relationships, and patron-client relationships that themselves are on the basis of norms that are both highly personalized and entirely unprincipled. The Yeltsin system, in the end, presented something similar to this, but in reverse form. In the Yeltsin system, money bought power. If you had enough money, you could privatize part of the state. Today's system is the opposite. Power buys money. If you have enough power and you covet someone's property or assets, doesn't matter who they are, you just take it. And all the instrumentalities of the state support you, and there's nothing that can be done. Which is why it's not even a system of unequal property rights. There are no property rights, which is why billionaires have to invest a large portion of their money abroad. The second point of this key point I want to make, and there are two others, is this. The system is bigger than Putin. This system I describe can survive Putin, and it can also get rid of him. This system, at the minimum, depends upon 50 to 100 very powerful individuals who hold a combination of billions of dollars or euros in resources and state power, and a lesser echelon of thousands of people who replicate this formula at a lesser level. And many will say quite correctly, many of these people are loyal to Putin and have been created by him. But let us please remember, we are talking about loyalty in a very treacherous political system. And let us remember also that every Soviet leader in the end was not toppled by his enemies, he was toppled by his loyalists, by his friends. So I am not here, despite my temperament, arguing for pessimism and saying all this will go on. What I'm really saying is we need to be very agnostic, and we have to resist every impulse to turn what we're looking at into a fairy tale and a morality play. My second big point is this. There are foreign policy implications that come out of this picture. It's not at all controversial today to say that the overarching aim of US policy, whoever is in power, is to maintain conditions in the world that are hospitable to the values of liberal democracy. I think that can fairly be said. I hope that, therefore, it's not outlandishly controversial to say that if there is an overarching policy aim in Russia, it is to maintain and, as far as possible, create conditions conducive to the survival and maintenance of the system of governance at home. And although this does not explain everything about Russia, there are orthodox geopolitical interests and so on, what I would say is that this impulse, which you could also see in the Brezhnev years when that system was declining, this impulse insinuates itself into everything else. If you look at Russian national interests in a rational way, as we did this morning in our panel on energy, you could see that the challenges are such that the only thing which will preserve and expand in future Russia's ability to participate in world energy markets is by creating a more liberalized competitive system. But such a system would totally undermine the system of power in Russia, and this is why it doesn't happen. And we shouldn't expect it to happen. The West is often expecting certain things to happen in Russia on the basis of rational arguments about rational interests, and these things don't happen, and I would suggest to you they cannot happen under the current political dispensation. My third point is this. We are, as in the late Brezhnev era, if my second point is correct, we're looking at a foreign policy which is basically defensive. It's about preserving positions that one has. But it is defensive in a very aggressive and proactive way. And this is something that we have great difficulty dealing with. Russia, in a very aggressive way, is, we should be no doubt about this, defending declining and waning positions and assets in the world. This model is under mounting attack and suffering from its own internal contradictions, and they are growing. And yet we continue to be caught off balance, and my final point is to ask the question, why? Many will say, oh, it's because Russians think strategically and we don't. I beg to differ. Russians have been very bad of late about thinking strategically. If you look about energy, they did not anticipate the shale gas revolution. There are all sorts of things which have been happening, which they have not anticipated. Only these people could maintain an enemy image in Ukraine and transform the most pro-Russian part of Ukraine into a region with anti-Russian sentiments. This takes extraordinarily perverse talents. This is not great strategic thinking. Russian tactics often succeed, but at a cost, because Russian tactics, the distinguishing feature about them is not simply they wreck your enemies, but they alienate your friends. They're very counterproductive. Where the Russians succeed is at what the Russian military scientists call operational art. That is the instinct and the ability to combine different means and methods and dimensions of effort to achieve a specific goal. Different means, institutions, methods that the West institutionally separates and intellectually does not connect. And this you could again see in energy. It's about pricing, it's about alternative energy projects, some of which are simply Trojan horses or designed to sabotage someone else. It's about privatization, it is about inducement, it is about bullying, it is about intelligence methods. All these things come together over issues that are important. This is operational level competence. And it's very difficult for the West to understand this is going on and to be able to devise means of responding to it. And for that reason, because this regime is very good at doing that, they are prolonging the agony. And this agony is not only causing more and more problems for Russia, it causes more and more problems for its neighborhood and for Europe as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Okay, so now, as we have our prism, I want to now get to Bobo, but I just want to kind of set it up. We had Lilia talking about the internal politics within Russia. We had Anders talking about the economy. We have James talking now, bringing us from an external viewpoint, international policy, looking at Russia. So we've had this prism of looking at Russia, which is helping me very much to kind of understand where we are going. But there's a factor that didn't exist, let's say, a year or so ago, and that is the opposition. Of course, the opposition has always existed. I don't mean, of course, that it never did. We've had it since the beginning of time. But it was a different opposition. We certainly didn't have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. We didn't have the internet. And now, within the last year or so, we've had demonstrations on the streets and something changing. I was just in Moscow covering the election, and although I wasn't there for very long, there is some sense of something changing. I'll leave it to our panelists to define what that is. But Bobo, let's look at the opposition. If right now, do they have any capability of really changing things within Russia? Or are they so split, so fractured, that it will be demonstrations to no real objective in the end? It will not change anything.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Kadri and her team, for organizing such a fantastic conference. In trying to answer your question, I'm struck by the contrast between my fellow co-panelists. Lilia has spoken very eloquently about an acute systemic crisis in Putin's Russia. Anders has found reasons for hope, modest hope, but believing that to some extent the system is reformable. James has highlighted some of the sort of structural features of that system and also warned us against taking this as some kind of fairy tale that will end inevitably happily. But what I want to talk about really is what would it take to achieve a fundamentally different political system with different norms, different values in Russia. And I think we need to take the focus away for a moment from the Putin regime or administration, however you like to call it, and focus on the opposition. Because it seems to me that Russia isn't going to change by itself, that despite all the acute problems that Putin and his cohort face, that they're not just going to go quietly into the distance. They're going to be pretty desperate to hang on. So it seems to me that there are some real challenges facing the opposition. So that's what I want to talk about today. I would summarize this as basically in terms of 7 challenges. The first challenge is that it's almost like a public diplomacy thing. The opposition has to counter the public perception or public portrayal of them as a bunch of spoilt, urban, middle-class dilettantes, supported by subversive elements in the West, specifically the US government. Now, the question is, well, how do you do that? Well, I think there are a number of ways, but one way is clearly you have to work, the opposition has to work on broadening its socio-educational base. Clearly some of this portrayal is caricature, it's not true. So you can't just gradually change your socio-educational base, you actually also have to work hard at projecting this new image. The second is you have to articulate an active policy program. I think we're moving into a different stage of the opposition. I'm not saying don't do big demonstrations. I'm not even saying that you should, give up saying Putin out, or Russia without Putin, or fair elections, or we demand the rule of law. But you have to go from the kind of general principles, general norms, into the boringly parochial and specific sometimes, which means that politics have to be local. You have to focus on issues that directly impact on people's lives. Not sort of, what are you against? Because it's obvious that you're against the corruption and venality of the regime. But what are you for? What can you actually do for me as the average Russian? To do that, there's the third point, which is you have to move away from the emphasis on personalities. You have to emphasize principles, policies, norms, institutions. Now, this is boring stuff, but you have to do it. Because it strikes me that if you play a highly personalized regime at the personalities game, you lose. You cannot possibly win. The regime is at its weakest not because of its personalities, but because of its lack of effective policy making. You have to focus on that. The fourth point. Now, the Russian liberal opposition is infamous in the post-Soviet period for its divisions. And clearly you have to avoid unnecessary divisions. But you also have to avoid the opposite extreme, which is to be all things to all people. Because the trouble with having a big umbrella coalition that combines all sorts is that it becomes really fuzzy about what you stand for. It just looks like mush. It means that, again, you're just emphasizing generalities, critical generalities, and not getting to policies that really directly affect people's lives for the better. Fifth point, I think it's really important to avoid over-radicalizing the political struggle. Now, of course, the political struggle is radical in itself. Of course, the regime is going to try and provoke the opposition. But in a sense, the opposition has to show unusual levels of self-restraint. It's incredibly difficult. There's no magic wand. But what the opposition, I think, needs to do is to show that when the regime engages in repressive measures on a large scale, that they do not do so with the backing of the uncommitted. It's about persuading the don't knows, yet to knows, the undecided, the uninterested. You have to, but in a sense, what's happening today, to some extent, is a struggle between the regime and the opposition for this broad, uncommitted, the unfocused. Now, it may be that the regime is going to collapse very quickly, but I think the opposition has to be ready for the long haul. It has to be patient. It has to be more persevering, more determined, more resourceful than the regime. Because the problem here is this. It seems to me that today, the regime's desperation to survive is greater than the opposition's desperation to unseat the regime. That's critical. And finally, the opposition has to be self-reliant. I know there's a lot talked, including today, about maybe what the West can do, about the West's collusion. I think you might not like what the West does by way of endorsing Putin or colluding in political and economic commercial ventures with Putin, but the fact is that's what they're going to do. Because the United States or the Europeans or China, anyone, they're going to think, do we really care that much about what happens in Russia? For all the talk about modernization, democratization, rule of law, frankly, the West does not care over much about what happens in Russia. They just want to have some sort of more or less stable, hopefully profitable relationship with Russia, but they don't really want the aggravation. They've got plenty of their own problems. They've got far more important priorities as they see it. So it's really important for the opposition to understand that basically no one out there is really going to help them. Sure, you can have some Magnitsky-type legislation. It isn't going to make a blind bit of difference. It has to come from within. That's the only way things can change. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. You know, I want to ask a question. We will, just to give you a roadmap here, we'll talk a little bit more, maybe 10 minutes. We'll keep comments now pretty brief, and then I want to open it up to questions. But you mentioned, Bobo, this uncommitted, the unfocused people. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you an example. When I was in Moscow, we were at a polling station, and I asked one man as he was coming out, who did you vote for? And he said, I voted for Putin. So I, of course, asked him why, and he said, well, I don't want Arab Spring in Russia. We don't want chaos. It reminded me of that comment by Russians going back to the 1991. We don't want chaos. That's the last thing we want. And then he added, without my even asking, in the next election, I might not vote for Putin, but right now he is the guy that I'm going to be voting for. So I'm going to ask that question. If for these uncommitted and unfocused people, is there a critical mass enough for them to say, that's it, I don't even care now about the stability. My life is so bad, or I want change so much, that I'm willing to look for change. And Lily, let me start with you. And again, keeping comments brief, because I really want to hear from everybody. What would you say, to the mood of that average person? Are they sitting on the fence? Are they looking for change? What?
Well, first of all, Jill, it seems to me before I will talk to this guy that is voting for Putin, I would prefer address our audience, because you folks have to be informed about, this so-called mass that is supporting Putin. For Putin and Putin's party, during the last elections, voted not more than 25-30% of the population. It's not 2/3 of the Russian population. It's less than 30% in reality. So Putin is the president of a minority. So a lot of people, voted. Either they didn't vote or voted for other parties or abstained, whatever. But Putin is not the president of the majority of the Russia. And among those people who voted for Putin, they don't like Putin. They voted only because there is no alternative. So it seems to me we don't have this very tough task dealing with the populations, persuading them, that Putin is a liability.
Okay, but then now that raises the question of whether there is some type of alternative. James, what do you say to this man at the polling station?
Jill, forgive me, but I'm skeptical, not just in Russia, but anywhere, about the notion of the average man. I think if you were to not only remove the immediate impediments in Russia to what the West likes to call free and fair elections, but remove the structural impediments, I think we would see a large part of the country that represents, by our standards, a much better Russia, whose values are absolutely mainstream in a Western European context, but we'd also see a large part of the country whose values are much more frightening, not only than ours, but than those represented by the present regime. And Russians are aware of that, and that affects what any voter faces, which is a tactical calculation about the vote is not based in any country simply on who do I like. A vote is not an endorsement. It is for many voters a decision about lesser evils and a rational decision about consequences. And this is why it's very difficult to interpret it. This is why I think some of Bobo's remarks are very important about the opposition defining itself and being very clear about what it represents and what its values are.
Bobo?
Yeah. I totally agree with Lilia that Putin is a president of a minority. I'm not making a case that Putin is in any way particularly popular. He's not. The problem is people don't see an alternative. So he's rubbish, but there is no alternative to rubbish. That's the stage that we're at now. Now, we're still at the very, very early stages. So alternatives certainly can emerge. But it's vitally important that the alternatives is not just some so-called charismatic figure. It's vitally important that the focus is very much on policies. Focus on the areas where the Putin regime is so egregiously failing. And that means not just criticizing. Of course, criticism is critical, is vital. But it actually means putting something in its place. And, even if it's something as boring as municipal garbage collection, or dealing with that particularly corrupt policeman on the street corner. It sounds ridiculous, really, but that's how you start. And you build up street cred that way. And it's showing how you can make a tangible, a concrete difference to people's lives that starts to get them to think your way. And then you can graduate from those sort of fairly boring banalities to more general principles. It'll be a process of education, political education, but it'll take some time.
Anders, James said that you can't talk about the average Russian, but I want to talk about the average oligarch. We kind of began to get into this. Putin depends, let's say, on the support of the elite, the economic elite. Are they smelling blood in the water, or do they still support Mr. Putin?
Well, first, if you take the top businessmen now, they really fall into three groups. You have the old oligarchs, who are now being called the white oligarchs. And then you have the Putin friends from the Orthodox cooperative, who are now called the black oligarchs. And then you have the heads of the state corporation. So you can say that during these three terms, Putin has lived or nurtured different groups of oligarchs. And all these three groups soundly hate one another. And Putin is playing on this at the same time as the black oligarchs, of course, the closest to himself. If you look upon the white oligarchs, they are very careful not to give any money to the opposition, because then they can be out, as we have seen a number of the oligarchs have been.
But just one a little bit more on that, though. So they're split, or do any of them perceive that Putin is beginning to be so weakened that they might not want to support him? After all, James said Putin is not the system.
No, they don't. But you can also see that they are taking out money heavily. Last year, $85 billion was taken out of Russia. The big oligarchs are buying a lot of enterprises abroad. The Russians bought residential property for $12 billion abroad, according to the Central Bank of Russia. All these transfers are perfectly illegal. The third and fourth biggest steel companies in the United States are Russian. Severstal and Eurasia group. The biggest steel pipe company in the United States is TMK, a Russian company. And this happens very quietly because these people don't want to make any noise.
Okay, well, I would like to open it up. We have about a half an hour of questions. Let's see where we are. There's a gentleman right down at the end. Yes, sir. I can't quite see who it is, but let's...
My name is Peter Balázs. I am Deputy Director General of the European Commission and therefore have been heavily involved in Russia's WTO accession. I take note of this positive expectation about the transformative effects of Russia's accession. But that being said, that although this was a very good common work between the EU and the US, and this is a very high-quality accession package, if I think about China, which is a member of the WTO for now over 10 years, I wouldn't say that alone this is transformative. Yeah. It contributes, but it certainly, I don't think, unfortunately, that alone it would have, could have such a major factor. I would have a question. There was no mention of this new Russian-dominated integration, the customs union, Eurasian economic union. Would be interested of the view of the panel, as this seems to be now, after the famous Russian quote that the biggest tragedy of the 20th century has been the collapse of the Soviet Union. For this presidency, he puts it as his first objective to build up this regional integration. How do you see the chances?
Thank you. I think that's an Anders question.
Yeah, thank you very much. First, I would comment on the first part of your point. China has opened up. China has become more liberal. It does violate a lot of intellectual property rights, but in each regard, I would argue that we have seen a steady improvement year by year. I totally agree with your intention behind the question. The Eurasian Union and the customs union make very little sense. Yeah. In effect, what Russia is doing is forcing Belarus and Kazakhstan to sharply raise, or not sharply, but raise their import tariffs, which disturbs the trade between Kazakhstan and the southern neighbors, makes the cars much more expensive in Belarus. And, of course, they don't buy Russian cars instead. So this is really an impediment for these two economies. And what is happening instead? They force Russia to pay back in by various means. Belarus got a 20 billion bailout package last November from Russia. So this is going completely the wrong way. So I totally agree with you, but I think that this is not the main theme, but it's certainly quite a big theme.
Okay. Mr. Piankowski, did you have a question? right there. Thanks.
Half a remark, half question to Bobo. Bobo, you did very just points that it would be very naive, foolish, and even arrogant from Russian opposition to expect from the West to care about Russian democracy, Russian human rights, so on, and so on. But it seems to me that there is a field when Western government and society has some obligation. Without cynicism of Western politics, they are a rule of law society.
Sure.
And they have their legislation preventing laundering of criminal capitals.
Yeah.
And everybody knows that Abramovich Milhouse company is a criminal offshoot.
Yeah.
Especially after Berezovsky Abramovich court proceedings with both were extremely frank and revealing. And Timchenko Gunvor is criminal offshoot connected directly to Mr. Putin. So don't you think that they should follow their own law, applying their legislation, using institutes of financial action task force against these criminal institutions?
Okay. Should they care?
Okay. From a moral, individual point of view, I completely agree with you. The trouble is, as maybe a cynical, jaded analyst, I just don't think it's going to happen. Because for example, the British government, to have people like Abramovich and other oligarchs dumping their money in the UK, buying property, owning football clubs, they see that as a very positive development. Now, it's utterly hypocritical because you preach rule of law, but you allow Russian oligarchs to benefit from a system where there is no effective rule of law. So from a moral point of view, I'm completely outraged by this. But from a practical point of view, I just know that they're not going to change. And it is a deeply cynical position. But I must say, in defense of the British government, no, I cannot see other Western governments, large Western governments, doing any better from either a moral or practical point of view. But I take your point completely. They should do better, but they won't.
Okay. And in the interest of time, I think what we'll do is we'll move to questions. If there's a reason for somebody else to join in, we can. But there's a lady right back there in the third row.
Thank you very much. I'm Kristiina Ojuland, member of the European Parliament. And I have two remarks, actually one remark and another question. My first remark goes to Mr. Anders Åslund, who mentioned that Russia is hopefully going to ratify the anti-corruption convention. But I would like just to remind, and I'm very pessimistic in this respect, if we see how Russia has been implementing its international obligations. Russia has been a member of the Council of Europe approximately 15 years. Does it implement the Convention of Human Rights? Does it allow these liberties or democratic values? No, they don't. And even the membership or the coming membership in WTO, in parallel, what we see in the country, the lack of the rule of law, the corruption, what according to the Indem think tank is about 35% of their economy. So there are a lot of big question marks. But my point is that we have seen that Russia is not respecting their international obligations. But my question is actually also very much linked to the Eurasian Union, but in broader terms. I was very curious, actually, from the panelists to hear more your vision or analysis Putin's ambitions externally. Of course, the Eurasian Union is one of the biggest ambitions, in my view, now in his administration. But in broader terms, because if you see how now, for example, how Kremlin is promoting Orthodox Church, Moscow Orthodox Church, around Europe, latest information is coming from Paris, for example, to build a new Orthodox church in Paris, and etc. Or how this Putin's or the Kremlin's administration is trying to gain the Russians now living in the European Union, the Russian community, how they try to influence. I'm not speaking only about Estonia, of course, but I'm speaking in broad terms in EU countries. So your analysis or views on the external ambitions of Putin. Thank you.
Okay. Could we do James and then Anders briefly?
Okay. This is not a complete answer, of course, and you wouldn't allow one. But let's not.
This is complete democracy. If you but we also have time constraints.
I think one has to remember, for very self-interested and often cynical reasons, the strong civilizational component to these aspirations, which is the term that's used. That there is a model of international relations which, for years, the current authorities want us to accept. It's based not only on multipolarity, but multiple values centers. And this is meant to be given by us a core legitimacy. That is what is fundamentally driving the Eurasian economic union, more than economics, which have been shown in at least more than one serious study to be deleterious to all concerned. That is why no alternative model must be allowed to be established anywhere in the East Slavic world. That is why this whole notion of Ruski Mir, the Russian world, is so important. But so this dimension has immense importance. A lot of energy is put into it. I think in Estonia you feel this very directly. Latvia feels it even more directly on the part of efforts to mobilize for Russian state interests a Russian diaspora that does not very often want to be mobilized for that purpose, but simply wants to achieve social and economic equality in the countries in which they live.
Anders?
Yeah, it's of course correct what you say, but I would rather turn it around. Russia is forced to recognize it. The largest number of cases to the European Human Rights Court in Strasbourg come from Russia. And they have some effect. Not all the effect should have. And it's the same now. Russia has ratified the OECD Anti-Corruption Convention. This gives the other members of it a lever to influence Russia. Russia wants to have a seat at each table,
yes.
And that also gives the other members around that table something to influence them with, and that's the same with WTO. But it's up to us to utilize it. What should be done is that we should have more transparency. Russia now buys a lot of people very concretely, and if you don't have transparency, we don't see it very easy. This is where Europe has to react.
Okay, Bobo, you wanted to jump in briefly.
Just a very quick comment on the Eurasian Union. Russia wants to be one of 3, maximum 4 poles in a global multipolar order. If you're a pole, you need a coterie. You need satellites, if you like. Where else can Russia look? Can't be it in Europe. It's a joke in Asia. So all it's left with is a kind of watered-down version of more or less Central Eurasia, Eastern Europe. The trouble is it won't work because it offers no positive pole of attraction. So it's one thing to want it, it's quite another thing to do it, or in Russia's case, not to do it.
Okay, Konstantin, there was a fight over the microphone here, but I think...
I can see to yeah.
Question one.
Okay, anyway, Konstantin Eggert from Moscow. I have 2 questions, and I'm really sorry we do not have anyone representing, I know, the US position per se, but if anyone cares to answer the first question about are we going to see something like Reset 2, because Reset 1 was like one stand-up comedian, are we going to get many stand-up comedians from the US bending over, it's quite interesting to me. The second question is probably to Lilia about, to respond to what Bobo said about the necessity for the opposition to persevere, develop policies, and be ready for a long shot. It seems that everything is developing in a reverse order. There's a scramble for who is going to be the icon of the Russian opposition, who is going to spend more time in jail and things like that. And it seems that, I'm being only slightly ironic, but is there a danger, this is an open question, of the radical left taking over the banner and carrying this transformation somewhere where it shouldn't be carried on? Thank you.
All right. Lilia, let's begin with that second question, okay?
Well, Jill, if I may only a couple of words commenting our discussion, I would really appreciate if my colleagues, especially my friends at the panel, would use Kremlin's Russia, Putin's Russia, when they're talking about the foreign policy of the state and etc. Because there are so many other Russians, James, and we here with my Russian colleagues represent totally different Russia. With respect to WTO, there is already a common knowledge in Russia that Russia has agreed, Putin's Russia has agreed to join WTO because the Russian elite knows how not to follow the rules of the game. This is firstly. Secondly, on Bobo, on your note that the Russian opposition, or maybe the Russian civil society, anticipates something from the West, your dialogue with Andrei Penkovsky, it seems to me that we have also national consensus among the political elite, and I mean of liberal, democratic, radical, whatever. We don't expect anything from the West. We expect the West to help itself, practice what you preach. And with respect to Magnitsky Act, it's not even about the Russian elite. It's about your returning to the moral and dimension and dignity, because it's going about corruption within the Western society. Yeah. With respect to the Russian mir, Ruski mir, etc., Christina can tell a lot more about that. It seems to me that the Putin's elite has been pretty skillful and elaborate, using not only the Russian diaspora, but even much more effectively the parliamentary assembly, the people living in Brussels in different capacities, Western pundits, experts, politicians. And I know one politician who is sitting in the first row, who has invented the term Schroederization of the Western political life, and he doesn't allow us to use it formally. I mean, use his authorship of the term. And the examples of the Yaroslav Forum, Valdai Club, where all Western experts, not only on Russia, but on all other areas of foreign policy and international relations, have started to queue now and anticipate the letter of invitation from the Kremlin. Well, it apparently says a lot about, the Western society in need of revamping and thinking about its normal dimension. With respect to Magnitsky, definitely it's about you folks. And Kostya, your question.
Reset?
Reset. Well, what kind of reset? Reset has been a tactical success and strategic failure. Well, it seems to me it's over even before Mike McFaul returned back to Russia. And the Russian side never even admitted that it has been a success. And the fact, how Putin has given slap in the face to President Obama only reconfirms what Americans do not want to acknowledge. Putin says, screw you. So what kind of reset? So Putin has started to reset in a different way. With respect to Kostya's very painful question that we are going to discuss during our really fun debate with Vine during the Russia evening session, I would say I don't know a single case, at least I don't remember from the example of the Velvet Revolutions, when the strategy, the organization of the opposition, the opposition, movement itself, emerged before the tide is coming. So the tide forces the movement to mature. And the fact that our protesters movement already has matured, coming, from a getaway with Putin to the demand, to change rules of the game and, to change the constitution, says that in 3 months we did what other countries have done during 10 years. With respect to the left wing, yes, this is our destiny, perhaps, that left-wingers, not nationalists, have much more drive, much more energy, and perhaps they need to be given their chance in order the society, will get, finish with all dreams with respect to the socialist alternative. It's a pity that we never gave the communist opportunity to win and get into the Kremlin.
All right. James.
On the Reset 2 question, what dismays me, and David Kramer has my invitation to jump down my throat, what dismays me about American policy as a whole, and it's relevant to this particular case, is that there's a dismaying tendency to define interests in terms of threats. And the reset existed to a large degree because Russia was perceived as being helpful to the main threat, which was Afghanistan. So the question you have to ask is, after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, to what extent is Russia going to be a preoccupation in the United States? Who is going to be thinking about it? I think the answer has to be it's going to be thought about even less than it is today. In the West as a whole, the problem is that most governments have what they call a transactional approach to Russia, which is a way of admitting we do not think about Russia strategically in a coherent way, but as a variable to be slotted into different problems we have to solve around the world.
Okay, so the clock says roughly 15 minutes, and we have a lot of questions. But David, you've been waiting very patiently.
David Kramer, Freedom House. Bobo, I want to pick up on Lilia's point on Magnitsky. You dismissed it. Yeah. Why then are they so nervous and upset about it?
Okay. Do you want me to answer that
Sure.
straight away? Or?
Absolutely.
Take more questions.
For this microphone, I
Whoa. Can we combine those questions?
Jill, shouldn't take more questions, and we can all respond.
Let's. We have now diminishing time. Bobo, quickly.
Okay. I think the Russians are worried, or it's not Russians, but the Putin regime is worried about Magnitsky, mainly for psychological, atmospheric reasons, not because it'll have any particular impact. The problem, it's humiliating. However, does this humiliation, or the prospect of humiliation, is that likely to push them to a more amenable position on democratization, the rule of law, anti-corruption? I really don't think so.
President Ilves.
Just a quick question. I was intrigued by the things that Bobo raised about what the opposition should do in terms of having a program. I mean, one way in which Estonia is completely different from the rest of the Soviet Union was that beginning with 86, 87, there developed over a period of 5 years a consensus of what needed to be done, mostly involving economics in terms of liberalization. And later on, everyone hated everyone anyway and became different parties. But there was a constant discussion and really focusing first on economics, but on other political issues and fundamental rights and freedoms that were battered about, and that was possible to do in the sort of loosened atmosphere of the Gorbachev period. Well, why doesn't the Russian opposition start developing a program, a serious program? I mean, everything beginning with a parliamentary as opposed to a presidential system, a constitutional model, rather than just being against having this is our alternative program. And in fact, when the moment arrives, when you have your square and the statue is toppled, then you actually know what you're going to do, as opposed to what we see, unfortunately, in Northern Africa, which is, now what?
Yeah.
Well, we have a member of the opposition right behind you, sir. So, Mr. Kasparov, you had a question, but maybe
no, as
you
for
can combine
regarding
a question
this,
and
the question that was asked, I recommend people who read Russian to read what has been written by opposition in the last 6 years. So, and stop calling for this necessity to start writing something which has been written, discussed, and I think it will be quite entertaining. In Russia, Putin's Russia, opposition is called extremists. So that's why, standing for my reputation, I should support, James and Lilia, and to be highly critical of anything that was provided by the center stage. Briefly about Magnitsky I think you got it absolutely wrong. This is a fundamental issue for Putin's regime. And they never used the entire power of Russian state, even threatening to cut American transit to Afghanistan to block Senate Bill 1039. Because Putin regime has been vigorously defending every teacher who is falsifying results in the school, every policeman who is beating people. There's no single action, criminal action, against people who were caught by committing crimes, because they know mafia boss must protect everybody, absolutely everybody, and that's how they survive. That's why Lavrov already warned Americans and Europeans as well that Magnitsky Law, if accepted, will severe relations between Russia and the West. And again, I don't want to still highlight from the Russian debate that will start in about 90 minutes. There's a lot to say about it, and again, I strongly disagree with almost everything that was said by two gentlemen in the center. But I think it's probably wise to finish this debate by answering a very simple question, and probably every member of the panel can answer. Do you believe that Vladimir Putin can leave power after losing the elections?
Well, who wants to try to even answer that?
Can I swing back?
Bobo, if you have an answer, I want to hear it.
On Magnitsky, I'm going to put the question back to you, but you can answer it tonight if you... Oh. Do you think, if the Magnitsky Law goes ahead in the United States and is, let's say, paralleled in some European countries, what policy impact do you think it would have on Putin? Obviously, it would make the US-Russia relationship rather uncomfortable, more difficult. Certainly, I'll buy that. But do you really think it's going to change their attitude to fundamental norms and principles? I really find that, I just don't buy it. I'm sorry.
Absolutely. Because then the chief of Moscow police will think 10 times before giving a criminal order to dismiss the demonstration. That's not about Putin. Putin will die in the office. Sooner or later, it will be defined by Russian people. Yes, but it's about those who are committing crimes following his orders, and they will be thinking many times before doing it and exposing themselves for possible actions. Because Russian elite, all top people, they keep money not in Iran, not in Venezuela, not in China. They keep money west of Tallinn.
Thank you, Mr. Kasparov. We have time for 2 more questions briefly. Sir, this gentleman and this gentleman.
Well, one thing which, when we discuss the opposition and its possibility to function effectively, is not to look at it from Moscow point of view, but from the provinces, and there the level of violence is much greater, and so the tactics used throughout 15 or odd years of Polish opposition of actually involving the local social forces is much more difficult in Russia. It's uncontrollable, people die, journalists die reporting the local. This needs to be taken, because I was asked many times why Workers' Defense Committee, Corps and Solidarity succeeded in Poland and didn't succeed, for example, in Czechoslovakia, Charter 77, etc. The answer was the level of repression. The Polish regime, whatever we say of Jaruzelski, etc., was much less and was much more predictable, and the members of opposition didn't have to linger in jail for many years. This is one thing which is very, very important. The other thing is lack of willingness of the opposition, probably we'll discuss it later, lack of willingness of actually doing the dirty work. And the Belarusian case is even more obvious, where actually the whole opposition is being paid by the West, and the audience is in the West more than it is in their own country.
Sir, did you have a question?
The question which I wanted to put is something which was not mentioned, is the internal tensions within Russia, especially ethnic tensions, Caucasus. The obsession of the Russian leaders, whoever they are, it is not about Putin only, is the disintegration of Russia. How do you think the situation in the Caucasus, the ethnic complexity, the religious tensions, influence from the outside, Iran, Saudi Arabia, other Islamic forces, how it can influence the inner cohesion of Russian Federation?
That's a very big question. Lilia, can you put that into précis?
Respond in a one sentence, Henning. It seems to me that the Kremlin elite has no anymore obsession with the Northern Caucasus, because it's under Putin, Russia started to fragment. Northern Caucasus, and first of all, Chechnya, do not belong to Russia anymore because they operate, function, survive, live beyond the Russian constitutional space. And this is, well, intentional, conscious trade-off. Stability for ruining the Russian state and constitution. Russia is, in fact, is a frozen empire that has failed to disintegrate at the moment. And it started to disintegrate starting with the Northern Caucasus, which raises among our political and intellectual community quite open debate how long Russia will be preserved in the current geographical format. And there are a lot of people who don't believe, in the Russia, within the current boundaries and map. So, well, this is just the process that has started. The ball is rolling.
We have one more question, sir.
Thank you. I'm Thomas Bertelman. I'm the Swedish ambassador to Moscow.
The best of the best.
Thank you for a very good discussion on what Putin, what the opposition, and what the West will do and should do. I would say they have one thing in common. They were all equally surprised by this winter's demonstrations. But there were actually some studies predicting this, measuring and reporting on very deep-going and fairly rapid changes of values and attitudes. And of course, you know that, for example, the Center for Strategic Analysis has come out. They now predict that this is moving fast. It will continue out of the big cities, and it will continue out of what is called the middle class. And my question then is, it seems, for many embassies watching in Moscow, it seems that we will have to focus on the regions and what happens in the regions, because who is the opposition, what are the new names, etc. It's quite common to make a comparison to Russia in 1988, where there were no new names, no figures, and then you had the elections to the People's Congress, and suddenly Russia was bursting with new personalities and people's tribunes. And my question then to you is, do you see that this is really the way forward for the next couple of years? It will not be so much in Moscow, it will be in the regions.
Yeah. James, regions?
Very, very interesting point. I think one does have to look there, but one has to look elsewhere. The Foreign Intelligence Service has already shown itself as being very capable in handing compromising information to people who use it to put the current authorities under pressure. Not because there's anybody there who wants to replace this system with something else, but there are people there who are intelligent enough to know there must be some kind of refurbishment for it to survive. These 50 to 100 power brokers I mentioned, half of them are probably not even known in the West. And they are not all, by any stretch of the imagination, inert and stupid people. So if you look towards 2018, you could see a lot of scenarios developing which might make it advantageous for President Putin nicely to agree under a set of guarantees not to stand a third time and to cede a lot of his de facto authority before that point. I think we have to be very agnostic about all these possibilities. We are not looking at simply a black and white scenario of either Putin or something totally new.
It is 7:30, so it's time to... Yeah. I'm sorry. I think they did. I think they did. There's time for all of us tonight.
I answer it.
I think what we ought to do is hold that until tonight, 9 o'clock. We have another great discussion.
You'll answer it tonight.
Thank you very much. The microphone will be handed around. I thought, excellent panel. Thank you very, very much. And thanks for the questions.